Hi, we are on Module 2, Physical and Cognitive Development, and this is Part 2, and we are on Week 4. Here are our objectives for this module. You can take a few seconds and read these over, but we are focused on cognitive development for this screencast. So when we talk about cognitive development, we're actually really just talking about the brain, because it's completely related to brain development. We know from past sessions that the brain's purpose is to create, store, and process information. So when we're talking about cognitive development, we're really talking about young children's ability to grow in their capacity of making sense of the world. But in order for this growth to occur, children must make connections between neurons and build those lasting pathways. So that's the brain wiring that we talked about last week. A little bit more about the brain, but more connections are made the first 3 years of life than at any other time in your life. And healthy brains are critical to cognitive development. I always like to take this time to put a plug in for those of you who work with infants and toddlers, because really what you're doing in those stages is going to be critical for a healthy, successful adult down the line. We oftentimes think of preschool as being when learning occurs, but really the foundation for learning starts in infants and toddlers, and we really need strong teachers at those stages so that children are prepared to go into preschool. So we are going to talk about what cognitive development looks like in birth to actually up to preschool, but we're going to start with birth to 3 months. So during this time, infants are really working on focus and attention. Vision is blurry at birth, but infants do have the ability to do some things like pay attention to faces, follow noises. They're also going to start to experiment with reflex actions, and they're going to adapt those reflexes to their environments. It's really about cause and effect, which is going to be a theme that we're going to continue to talk about as we move through. Additionally, they will show a preference at this age for certain objects and voices, like their mothers. They will also stare at a smiling face longer than a still face. They really like patterns, especially black and white, so you may have seen some of those board books that are meant for infants where all of it is just black and white. At this stage, they're not quite aware of themselves yet. They still consider themselves to be as one with their primary caregiver, and they may start to socially smile around 2 months of age. In 3 to 6 months, they develop a few more skills, so they learn that they can touch, shake, and hit objects. They'll start to show judgment and preferences, and this you can definitely be seen by, I want to be held by this person and I don't want to be held, or I don't want to be held by that person. They will increase their vocalizations. They're going to respond to touch in new ways. They will think about their senses and movement, but that's just perceptual development and spatial awareness, which we've already talked about. And then again, back to that cause and effect. So this is really important for them in figuring out how the world works and how to get the things that they want and need. During 3 to 6 months, although starting at infancy, this is important too, it's really important that you're providing face-to-face time with infants, because this teaches them about language and communication, how to recognize the emotions of others, and it also builds their feelings of self-worth. And all of those are social and emotional skills. So you should start to see a pattern here of how physical development is tied to cognitive development, which is then tied to social and emotional development. Memory, foresight, and self-awareness, which also support social and emotional development, are all starting to develop at this stage as well. So, in 6 to 9 months, again, some new skills are learned. So as long as we have the proper experiences in place, skill development will continue to happen. Object permanence, which is actually from Piaget's theory, and really all that is an infant's ability to hold a mental image or picture of an object or person in their mind, and to understand that when that object or person is out of sight or beyond hearing, it continues to exist. So you can actually YouTube this and see videos of infants who have gained this skill and infants who have not. So what they tend to do is they will take an object and they will hide it under a blanket. If the infant starts to look for the blanket because they know, like, hey, just because so-and-so took it and put it under that blanket, it's still there, then that means they developed object permanence. If they don't seem to care or notice that the object is gone, it may be because they have not developed this skill yet. Joint attention also develops, and so this is important in terms of intention, reference, spoken language, and literacy acquisition. But essentially all that is when two people share focus on an object or an event. So this would be like if an infant points to something, an adult follows that child's lead and then starts talking about the object. That is joint attention. Cause and effect is still really important and will continue to be important. Communication skills are also starting to expand at this age, but crying is still the main source of communication. And infants between the 6 to 9 month range may be able to recognize their name when called out. In 9 to 12 months, there's a little bit of shift in how their thinking occurs. So they're more intentional about their goals, and they are starting to have definite ideas about what they want. They can also begin to anticipate certain events, but usually they can only do this if those events are part of a routine. And that's why routines are important for young children. It helps them build up those neural pathways. You might also start to hear some single word expressions, usually in reference to objects, people, or actions. Infants' hearing and speech are going to continue to develop in the 12 to 18 month age as they shift into toddlerhood. That cause and effect in problem solving and experimentation is still going to be extremely important. They may be able to pick up a few words like daddy or mommy. The first words are always usually familiar items, but they do not yet know how to combine words to communicate. In 18 to 24 months of age, there's going to be another shift in thinking. So children are going to change their approach to the environment. They can start to think before taking action now. So it's less of that I just need to touch everything and see everything and do everything, and it's more of that intentionality. Like I know that if I do this, this might happen. They are going to start to apply some of those learned problem-solving techniques that stem from all the cause and effect that they were doing when they were younger. They can start to sort and classify, but we still know that they need to actively explore just about everything. Those of us who are working with toddlers know they are busy, busy people. When we shift to 2-year-olds, there is a heavy focus in terms of cognitive development on language skills. So when we're talking about language skills, we're talking about comprehension and expressive, and sometimes you'll hear comprehension referred to as receptive language, and we'll talk about that actually on the next slide. We do know that language is something that is learned rapidly, but it is only learned rapidly as long as children are being taught to. So they need those experiences, they need that back and forth with somebody. So expressive and receptive language. So essentially expressive language is a child's ability to communicate either non-verbally or verbally. So this can be body language, or it can be verbal words. Receptive is a child's understanding of the meaning of the message. So that's that comprehension piece. We know that infants begin processing language well before birth. We, as humans, are ready to be born into any family, any place on earth, and we can begin to acquire language. We also know that there are some strategies that you can use as an early childhood educator that will support with language development. So one strategy is called feeding in, and the other is expansion. So feeding in is when you provide the child language. Expansion is when you expand upon the child's language. So let's take an example of a child playing with a truck. You could feed in by saying, that's a yellow truck. But if the child already had the terminology or the vocabulary to say truck, you could expand upon it by saying, yes, that's a yellow truck. So if a child said truck, you could say, yes, that's a yellow truck, as opposed to you giving them the language. You should be using both strategies with young children because that's how they learn language, both the expressive and the comprehension piece of it. We're going to shift now to preschool. So we know that social interaction and play is one of the biggest things that you can do to promote cognitive development because they're all interdependent upon each other. So cognitive development impacts social development, which impacts language, and vice versa. So they all work together. Really, you're still allowing children to work on those cause and effect skills through social interaction and play. We also know that child-directed free choice environments are really what's best for children. And I should state that child-directed free choice does not mean mass chaos. You still have a role in what goes on in that classroom. You are still the facilitator, but you're using the children's interests and ideas to support their cognitive development. There's actually a lot of research now that preschoolers who engage in socio-dramatic play attune longer, show higher levels of involvement and cooperation during that time. We also know that when preschoolers experience lots of child-directed free choice activities supported by various equipment and materials, they have better cognitive and language outcomes than their peers. One big piece of cognitive development for preschoolers is this idea of executive functioning. And executive functioning is directly related to brain development. It is a set of processes that deal with managing oneself and one's resources to achieve a goal. When you're talking about executive functioning in preschool, we're talking about working memory, mental flexibility, and self-control. And really what we're trying to do is develop these skills in preschoolers. So they are not fully developed by any means, and we wouldn't expect that. But we're helping them through experiences to develop working memory, mental flexibility, and self-control. Executive function develops in the brain's cerebral cortex. It's functions that regulate children's attention and memory, and they're not fully developed yet, which we talked about. They need lots of opportunities to practice and improve these skills because these are the skills that you need in adulthood. These are the skills that you need to be successful in a workplace as an adult. You will watch a video this week about executive functioning, so pay close attention to it. We will talk about it in our face-to-face meeting as well. So, to kind of sum up, here are some things that you could do in terms of cognitive development to help children learn these skills. You need to do practice and plenty of support. You should provide time for play, especially socio-dramatic play. You should understand developmentally appropriate practice, including age limitations, but also note that children have enormous capacities to learn given the right context. Ask open-ended questions. Use scaffolding, so know where children are, meet them where they're at, and then move them along. Provide opportunities for children to make those neural connections, and plan engaging activities that invite exploration, documentation, discussion, and the development of new ideas. One other thing I want to touch on very quickly before we sign off is creative development. So creative development is defined in multiple ways. It's anything that is meaningful to children. So it doesn't necessarily have to be art. It could be telling stories, listening to music, making music. As long as it's meaningful to children, it's creative development. And really what it refers to is children actively producing ideas, inventing, or making something for the first time, or coming up with unique and different ways of expressing their thinking. So why is creative development important in early childhood? Today's children are going to grow up in a world very different than the present. They'll work in careers that do not yet exist, using methods and technologies that have not been invented, and they'll value commodities that have not been created. And creative development supports this because you are developing fluency, which is the ability to generate new ideas, flexibility, which is the ability to move from one idea to the other, and elaboration, which is using an existing idea and extending it, and originality, which is forming unique possibilities. So these are really important skills for preschoolers and infants and toddlers to learn. All right, before closing out, you do have your first competency statement due. You are working on a focus statement on how you will advance the physical and intellectual competence of the children in your care. So this will include what you will do or what you are already doing. It covers the following functional areas. You can find more information in your CDA manual on these pages. Remember APA, no less than a page, no more than 2 pages. And there is an example in Canvas. Next week, you have another lesson plan due, and your competency statement, and your check your knowledge. As always, reach out if you have any questions. We will be moving on to social and emotional development next week. Thanks.